Hey, welcome to video 3 in the Heart of Hearts quilt along. If you haven't already, make sure you go back and check out video 1, which covers cutting, and video 2, which covers piecing. This will be a short video. I'm just going to briefly touch on how to assemble the quilt blocks into a quilt. You will need your pattern so that you know the exact number of cuts you need to make and the size of the borders. So let's start going over how to put all of these fun heart blocks into a quilt. Just to recap where we are making the Heart of Hearts quilt. There are 2 previous videos in this series. The first one walks through cutting and the second one walks through piecing of the heart blocks. So to catch you up where you should be, based on our last video, you should be finished with step 3 and ready to move on to step 4. So take a moment and make sure that you have all of the pieces that you need for step 4. That you've cut everything out. All of the cutting guides and cutting directions are here on the first page, so that you have everything you need to cut from the background fabric. This quilt is constructed by rows. It's pretty straightforward how it is done. You have, for the most of the quilt, you're going to have every other quilt block, excuse me. You're going to have a heart block and a plain square, and then you've got some border pieces here, 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 and here that the measurements for those are on the first page, so you know what to put where, but we're just going to assemble it by rows. And the row assembly is all right here, rows 1 through 10. So I was trying to think of how I could best demonstrate this to you guys. And so I thought I would start with answering a couple of the frequently asked questions that I got in the YouTube comments and on Instagram. So the first one was, for these heart blocks, do I press the seams on the back? Do I press the seam to one side or do I press it open? This one, I have pressed it to one side. If you are noticing that your blocks are coming up significantly smaller than the 4.5-inch square that they should be, then I recommend you switch and press it to open. So there is one of the blocks with the seam pressed open. What sometimes happens when you press to one side is you don't get like, this one's good because you can see I've like wiggled my iron all the way down into that seam and I can actually see the stitching on here. Sometimes what will happen, you can kind of see it here, is if this doesn't get pulled back all the way when you press to one side, I mean, you can see there's maybe like a 1/16 of an inch of fabric right there. What will happen is your blocks will end up coming up a little bit short. And what happens, I think, sometimes when you press a lot of blocks like we did for this quilt, is you just get going so fast that you don't notice that you don't have that seam totally flat. But as far as construction goes, it doesn't matter if you press this center seam open or to the side. It's just personal preference. Most of the blocks in the quilt are sewn in a pattern. I don't know why I couldn't think of that. A pattern of a heart block, a plain square, heart block, plain square, heart block, plain square. So I thought, since there's no way I can show you like the whole big giant quilt, I thought I would just create a small section of the quilt that I can turn into a mini quilt or a pillow, which I'm going to show you next. The other question I got is, do I trim and square these up to 4.5 by 4.5? I don't, unless they're really far off. I have a 4.5-inch ruler here, so I can see that this is pretty dang close to 4.5 by 4.5, but you will notice that up in this corner I am short on my 4.5. Something happened when I stitched this together, so I'm short 1/8 of an inch. So I am not going to do anything to this, because what I can do is I know that this block is going to get sewn next to another square block. So what I'll do when I sew them is I will line the heart block and the square block right up on top of each other, and I'll get everything nice and centered. And you can probably see, I might zoom in, you can see how I have a little bit of extra up here and down there. What I will do then is I will stitch this, and when I stitch it, once I know everything's in place, I'm going to stitch it on the with this fabric up, not the block up, and stitch it with my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because what that will do is, let's say I'm short, you can see I'm kind of short right here. Like there's a little bit short right here. But if I sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'll have a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, and then when I get to this point, I might only have 1/8 of an inch. But I still have plenty of a seam allowance to hold this together. But what that will do is if I square it up to the square next to it, then it squares up the heart block at the same time. If you are off by a lot, like more than 1/8 of an inch, you may want to go and just trim or replace like this little piece of the block. But I wouldn't worry about it unless it's significantly off, because you do have the opportunity to square it up as you sew these pieces together. So here I have one heart block sewn in the center, and I've got the two, I'm going to zoom back out now, and I've got the two squares sewn on each side. So you can see I have a straight line here, but let me see if these ones actually lined up pretty close. But if it was short, I would have, you know, like a straight line here, and then I'd have maybe a little bit shorter of a seam right here. But it all works out, all comes out in the wash, for lack of a better term. So I want to talk about pressing these. As you are assembling, let me get the diagram. As you are assembling these, and you need to count and make sure you get the right number in each row and stuff, you will need to press the pieces in that row before you sew the rows together. So there is a shortcut for this. What I recommend doing is, as you sew your rows together, or as you sew your rows, always press the seam allowance going away from the heart. So you can see I have the seam allowance going this direction here, and then on this one, the seam allowance is going this direction because it's going away from the heart. And since the majority of this quilt is set up as an every other heart layout, what this will allow you to do is, as you sew your rows together, you'll be able to nest your seams. And we talked about nesting seams a little bit in the last, video when we were talking about the heart blocks, but this is another place that you can use the seam nesting trick. So since these seams are pressed opposite directions, I can pin this. And there you can see how I've pinned this. And since I do want to make sure this is square, I'm going to actually add a little extra pin over here just to keep it so it doesn't like go like this as I sew. So I'm going to pin it here. And pin it there. And then I'm also going to pin down here. All right, so now these seams, let me get it to focus again. These seams are in opposite directions, and they are able to lock into each other as you sew that together. And what that will do is allow you to get a more accurate point or corner as these blocks are sewn together. So I'm going to sew this on my machine, and then I will sew the bottom to it as well, just so you can kind of get a feel for how a portion of the quilt goes together. All right, I have these 3 rows sewn together. So just pretend that this is like one of the center sections of your quilt. You can see how that nesting trick really helped me to line up those corners. This one is off a little bit, but I'm not going to fix it because you're not going to notice it. This trick is especially useful as you sew really long pieces together with multiple blocks, because it's easy to notice that you're a little bit off as you sew down the row. So it kind of just helps you keep your pacing and your spacing correct as you sew the row. I wanted to show you one more trick before we wrapped up as far as seam pressing goes. So this top row, I have pressed the seam open. A lot of you guys I know love to press seams open, and this is totally personal preference, whatever works for you. So this one's pressed open. The thing I don't like about this is that it makes this little point and these little points, they don't want to lay flat because there's a lot of fabric right there. So what you can do is this block wants to have its seam pressed up. This block wants to have its seam pressed down, and this block wants to have its seam pressed up. So you can take some scissors and just lightly trim, making sure you don't trim through the seam allowance, because I have done that before, and split that seam so that you can go to your iron now and you can press it so that this one's not done all the way. I probably need my reading glasses as I can't see this very well. There. So now when I press it, I can press this seam down of these blocks and this seam up, and it just kind of helps eliminate the bulk of that little tip being folded over the top of each other. But it's like I said, personal preference, whatever you feel. I have a long arm and I've done it both ways, and I haven't had any problems with the seams in my long arm, but I know a lot of you guys really like to reduce bulk in the seam, so that is a good trick on this quilt to do that.